Well, thank you for joining us for this conversation about race and our child protection system. My name is Amy Brady, and I'm a policy associate with Voices for Vermont's Children. I have a lot to say, but I will try to be brief. I want to start by acknowledging our co-host, the Root Social Justice Center. I have a lot to learn from them. They have spent multiple decades advocating for change. They know the intersection between racism and child protection, and their urgency for action has been clear long before this recent wave of activism in Vermont. Shela Linton will join us later in the session and will share more about their work. I also want to acknowledge Kit, our communications expert, who has been incredibly helpful in organizing this series. Before I introduce our featured guests, I'd like to share a little bit about why Voices decided to host this series with the Root Social Justice Center. Many of us hear child protection and we think of DCF. I invite you to broaden that lens, both today and in our work going forward. Our child protection system is all of us. I believe that true accountability can only be achieved when we are brave, when we are humble, and when we are able to reflect. If Vermont intends to be accountable to our children, then we need to take opportunities to listen deeply and open ourselves to uncomfortable truths. I want to be clear that we will not use this time to debate systemic racism. We are beginning today with the understanding that racism is real and that it is pervasive. I want to acknowledge that engaging in this conversation will require some level of vulnerability and trust. At times, we may need to sit in our own discomfort. My goal is to avoid talking about each other, but instead I encourage us to talk to each other. Many of us can easily identify racism elsewhere, such as the current crisis with family separations at the border. But it is more difficult to look inward, to examine our own implicit bias, and to see how we have missed opportunities to reconcile our past and create anti-racist practices in the present. This session is intended to create context so that we can move towards restorative future. Please remember that this session is being recorded. By participating, you are opting into this public event. Context matters. Race, as we know it, is a human construct designed to oppress, and our history runs deep. Removing Native children from their families and tribes of origin was once federal government policy in the United States. Assimilationists sought to strip Natives of their language, culture, kinship, and belief systems. Thousands of Indigenous children were taken to boarding schools, where many were abused. By the 1970s, research found that approximately 25 to 35% of all Native children in the US were being placed in foster homes, adoptive homes, or institutions. And 85% of these children were being placed outside of their families and communities, even when fit and willing relatives were available to care for them. Research has shown that Native children in foster care who stayed connected to their culture did better, and those who weren't were at greater risk for behavioral and mental health problems. Foster care was also used as punishment for people who could not pay their debt, sometimes alternatively described as a way to rescue children from poverty. We know that extreme wealth has been dependent on extreme poverty for many generations. We don't have to search hard to find policies that kept Black and brown families in poverty well after slavery was abolished. It wasn't until a child was severely abused in a foster home that the idea of child abuse became an offense to investigate. Prior to that, the United States followed the colonial tradition where children and women were considered the property of the father or the male head of the household. From orphan trains to our long history of prioritizing profit over people, much healing is necessary. Even with our best intentions, the legacy of oppression remains. In order to redeem our past, we are moved towards rescuing those who were oppressed. This mentality is damaging as well. It is time to shift our focus and our power in order to truly support children within the context of family. We know that nationally, Black and brown families are more likely to be reported to DCF for child maltreatment than their white peers. We know that Black and brown children and youth enter care at higher rates than their white peers. We also know that in Vermont, while in care, children of color have more placement moves. We know that the more moves a child makes while in care, the more likely that they are to have poor outcomes, including incarceration. We know that kids in care are far more likely to have kids in care themselves. It is all of our responsibility to break this cycle. Racism was not an accident. It will not disappear without intention. In order to fully support children and families, we need to examine our current outcomes, review our practices, and open ourselves up to see the things that we have been trained not to see. In doing this, our entire child protection system will be better off. As you can see, we have a lot of ground to cover and limited time today. Please take the opportunity to participate in this conversation through the chat box, and we will do our best to be responsive throughout the session. Two of our guests have commitments at 1. I would now like to invite Allison, my colleague from Voices for Virginia's Children, to briefly introduce herself, and then want to give Xusana Davis and Dr. Jay Metz an opportunity to do the same.
Hello, my name is Allison. I'm really pleased and excited to have this brave conversation with everyone today. I am a policy analyst at Voices for Virginia's Children, where we just went through a very similar process in our state addressing racism in the child welfare system. Another hat that I wear is I'm also an adjunct professor at Virginia Commonwealth University in the School of Social Work. But all of those titles mean nothing in comparison to the lived experience that I have being a child that having lived experience in Virginia's child welfare system, in the foster care system, as well as being a parent now myself. And so I guess we can kick it over to Xusana.
Okay, buenas tardes, everyone. I'm Xusana Davis, Racial Equity Director for the state of Vermont, and very, very pleased to be here with you today. You know, when we talk about systemic racism, it's such a difficult topic for a lot of people to grapple with, because we all come into this topic from a different perspective, from a different vantage point. Some folks have lived experience with the subject matter. Some have more academic and technical expertise with the subject matter. Others simply see something, they know it doesn't feel right, they're not quite sure why, but they want to do something about it. And a lot of us fall somewhere in between all of those. I came into this role about a year ago, and I just want to talk very briefly about what the role entails. Alongside my role, Executive Director of Racial Equity, was also created a Racial Equity Advisory Panel. These were created by an act of the legislature in 2018. And the purpose of my role in the panel are to evaluate and identify systemic racism in all 3 branches of state government, to develop model policies and best practices for how to mitigate that systemic racism, to develop and conduct trainings for all state agencies, to liaise between the Governor's Workforce Equity and Diversity Council, the Governor's Cabinet, and the Human Rights Commission, to sit on a number of committees, including a recently formed Racial Equity Task Force, which I chair, and a number of other sort of behind the scenes, unseen work. And I think all of you in your practice are familiar with that unseen work. It never shows up in the job description, but of course it's essential to the health and the functioning of the work. Notice nowhere in that role does it say make people less racist or change hearts and minds. It would be nice, sure, if people could generally be less racist. And I wish if I were bold enough, I would get a tattoo on my forehead that just says, can you not? Because sometimes that's just how I feel. But it's not necessarily an explicit part of the work to make individuals less racist, but rather to reduce systemic racism. And the problem with that is that systems are just people. The system is a collection of individual people. And so when we think about how to mitigate systemic racism, it also means that we have to do, as was said earlier, a lot of introspection, a lot of individual level thinking. And I'm not sure if this is supposed to be a basic intro or a substantive, so I'm gonna leave it there. But again, I know we're gonna have a really rich conversation today, and I'm very grateful to be here.
Good afternoon. I'm James Metz. I'm a pediatrician at the University of Vermont Medical Center and Children's Hospital. I work as a child abuse physician here at the university and interface a lot with DCF in helping them with cases of child abuse and neglect. Part of the work that we're doing here at the hospital is to take a look at the systems that we have here that may be biased and have in the past or currently led to reports or lack of reporting based on some of this systemic racism or bias that's in the medical profession. So developing protocols and guidelines that help physicians, medical providers do the right thing for the right reason and not fall into the trap of missing a diagnosis or over-diagnosing abuse or maltreatment based on some other factors that may or may not be may or may not be aware of. So I'm glad to be a part of this conversation and am happy to answer questions about our role here at the hospital.
Great, thank you. And before we move to Allison, Shela, are you available to give a brief introduction?
Sure, thanks, Allison. Hi, everybody. My name is Shela Linton, and I'm one of the co-founders and co-directors of the Root Social Justice Center. And I'm also one of the people with Vanessa Santana, who helps run a program called Families United out of the Root Social Justice Center. And Families United is a group of people who are peers who have been impacted by the DCF system, who are coming together to talk about how to support each other, how to heal, and how to make systemic change, both within the legislation and within our communities. And I'm really, really excited to be here today. And I'm excited that we are talking about racism and kicking off this listening session by talking about racism, especially with the uprise that is happening, everything that is happening in our communities. I'm just, it's a pleasure for me to be co-hosting this today and to be here with all of you. So thank you.
Thank you. Allison, are you available to?
Yes. It's great to see you again, Shela, and thanks. I know some of you are just joining, and before I give my spiel of where I want to start, I just want to communicate to you how I like to engage with audiences over Zoom even. So in my culture, if you're agreeing with something that I have to say, you can do like snaps, you can say, yes, I understand. Or you can just even type that in the chat and say, yes, girl, I'm feeling what you're saying. Please keep talking. Those sort of things. That makes me feel like I'm in community with you. But also, if you are, have a question, you can say, please explain that more, different things like that. We want engagement as a part of this conversation. It's really important. So please utilize the chat section for any of that kind of thing. But I wanted to take a really, really big step back, because sometimes when we talk about racism in the child welfare sector, we can ground ourselves in the here and now because it feels like what we know. But I want to take us back and really talk about starting around slavery, because it is a big part of our country's history, and it is the thread that you will see throughout child welfare history. So of course, our country is founded in a rich history of racism and in slavery in every community in this country, and it directly has impacted the child welfare system. So when we were a country that our economy was dependent upon the enslavement of people of color, people did not see people of color as human beings of value. Our traditions that we have as a community are often grounded in things that communities of color had to do during those times. And we still see those things today. However, those things still continue to lack for others to see the value in those systems. And then when we think about the fact that the child welfare system was created during a time when our community was still very much divided by race, just sit in that for a second. We try to tell ourselves that the child welfare system's primary purpose of creation in the first place was to protect children from harm. However, think about the fact that there were children in your community and my community who were not safe because of the color of their skin. And that persists today, but even in the very original development of this system. And we have a system that is made up largely, even today, of non-people of color who are running it, creating the policies, and really determining what makes a good family and what makes a safe family. And when we also think there's going to be a lot of intersectionality between child welfare system and other systems, one of them being the police. The police also too has a rich, their history and connection to slavery is even closer, and it can be hard. So I also want to say the things that I'm saying, I know may cause a little bit of heartburn, a little bit of heart palpitations when I talk, because it feels uncomfortable. It feels like, no, we're not a racist system. We're not doing these things intentionally, but it's important to take a step back and say some of it's so systemic because we have a system that was grounded in what is a good family considered by white families. And those things may not always align. So that's a lot to take in, I'm sure. So I wanted to give Shela the opportunity to provide her thoughts on that. I know she has a lot of thoughts on the connection between slavery and also Jim Crow laws and those things and how they have impacted the child welfare sector.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Allison. Great to see you too. So I just actually, my time that I wanted to spend talking to all of you today was really just to bring the connection on the ground to what has been happening through my experience. For almost 2 decades, I have been an advocate for families who have been impacted by the DCF system within the state of Vermont. During these times, focusing on this particular theme that we're talking about, which is race and racism, I've encountered multiple people across races and cultures within the system here in Vermont. I've worked with Indigenous people, I've worked with Black folks, I've worked with Latinx folks, I've worked with multiracial families. And something that's a common theme that kept on coming up for these folks is their need to, one, prove themselves. And what Allison is saying is to fit into that what is a good parent and what meets a good parent. I wanted to talk about just a little bit of the experiences I had, such as when working with Indigenous people, them trying to prove their tribal recognition in order for their children to be placed with kinship. For Indigenous people to be disconnected from their families and have no rights as actual individuals, as peoples within their race and within their culture, and that preventing them from actually being able to have their children. That there are many systems and policies that are embedded in the systems and policies of DCF that are preventing people of color and Indigenous folks from accessing their needs and from being able to be with their families. I've worked with Black families and with multiracial families who have continuously stated to me that their cultural heritage has not been represented, that their children are consistently put into white families. And the explanation is that we're predominantly white state. That's what we have. That's what we can do. And then they're losing their culture. They're losing their heritage. They're losing themselves. Often, even to this day, I know children who don't even know that they're a person of color until they are a teenager because they've been assimilated or whitewashed by the families in which they've been fostered or adopted into, with no acknowledgement or recognition of who they are, where they've come from, and who their family originates from and their culture. Through these experiences, there has been a lot of back and forth, and even working with some foster parents who have come to me and have said, Shela, I'm having trouble. I'm fostering a child of color and I'm not getting the support that I need from the system, meaning the DCF system. They're not acknowledging that I don't know how to do this child's hair. They're not acknowledging that they walk out the door and they're brown and they don't look like me and the rest of the family. They're not acknowledging that they might have different health concerns or different needs in their lives, and consistently coming to me and asking, how do we change the system? How do I support these children? So those are some of the things that I've been experiencing over the course of the last decade. But in addition to that, I've had my own experiences as an advocate over the last 20 years, advocating for parents across the state, and my own experiences as an advocate of color. I have been discriminated against. I've been called the angry, aggressive person in the room. I've been blocked from meetings. I've been disparaged. I've had complaints made against me. And I'm walking into a professional capacity as a known advocate, stating my role in support of these parents. And I am treated in a very discriminatory way. And the words and the tactics and the things that are being said are just rooted in racism. Completely rooted in racism, to where myself, even as somebody you would say that is a professional, and I don't like to use that because I feel like that the people who are experiencing these things are the professionals. They are the experts in their own experience. I am not the professional. I am just there to support the families, but yet I am seen as a professional, but not treated as one. And I can't help but wonder what that has to do with. And when I question that, and when I bring up race, there's always a pushback on that of why, as myself going in to advocate for these families, looks very different from a white person going in who is supporting these families.
Sheila, can I add one thing to that? Because I wanted to share my experience as well in that same regard. I'm a person of color that appears that way. And I too have been in the experience of, I'm a professional. Pretty much if you work for our child welfare system in Virginia, you know who I am. However, I have also been in experiences where professionals of color have seen the difference in our treatment in the child welfare system that still persists today, between the white colleagues that I have and the people of color colleagues that I have, and the difference in treatment in the child welfare system. And so it's something, for one thing that I ask for every agency in DCF is to really, part of this work has to start internally, right? Like, some of it is asking the questions to your staff, to each other. Do we have a problem? The answer is probably yes. No matter how you may feel, there's probably some things that can be worked on, and especially for addressing the issues within the people of color on staff, because it can be so complex. And I wanted to give an example to show just how complex it can be. Sometimes there can actually be internalized racism, which means that I am internalizing the racism within myself and then projecting it onto someone else. So I was in a court hearing once, and one of the attorneys, who was a person of color, came to me and said, "Are you the neighborhood snitch?" And I was really confused about what they meant by that. But then I also knew what they meant. They looked at me as a person of color and assumed that I was there to snitch. I won't get into all of the details, but it's so complex. And if you can't have these conversations, you may not be able to unravel all the things that are contributing to the data, which I know we would get into soon. And I know Dr. Metz doesn't have but so much time, so I also wanted to ask him to share his perspective on racism, especially as it impacts the healthcare system and how it eventually impacts the child welfare system.
Sure, thanks. I really appreciate that perspective, and I think that there is a lot of data and a lot of research that's been done, not enough, that shows that there is bias within the system. And I think that from my perspective in the area of child welfare, child maltreatment, it's high stakes. And I find that, you know, I'd like to think that we're all well-intentioned and the system benefits or focuses on the health of a child. But I think that that's a little presumptuous to think that that's always the case. And I think that we just need to, where we can, build systems to, you know, push back against some of our underlying biases and racism is important. And so you know, there are many studies that show that, like was mentioned previously, that children from different either socioeconomic status or from different races with different color skin get treated differently in the healthcare profession, whether it's pain management, whether it's being reported to DCF, whether it's a workup, you know, the threshold for working up child abuse, it exists. And I think that, you know, one of the things I know that my colleagues across the country and that we are trying to do here is to build systems that are hardwired so that it doesn't, that we can get past those initial biases and apply the same standards to everyone. So a child comes in with a skull fracture, which is often a very low risk for abuse because that's fairly common, and based on the science and the medical piece, that everybody gets treated the same, that not one person doesn't get reported to DCF versus another family. And I think that that's really important. And to the degree that we can, you know, be a part of the solution in making those doing that kind of work, I think is really important.
Thank you, Dr. Metz. And Xusana, I also would love to hear your perspective as well. Thanks for that amazing introduction. But I know you have a lot more to say on this topic.
Yeah, you know, one thing that I want to go back to is something that was said by a few of you already, which is the idea about standards. In the introduction, we heard that children, what was it now? I think Indigenous children who are placed with members of their tribe or culture do better than children who are not. And one of the things that I like to look at is the way that we frame our thoughts about standards and language. I mean, for example, one way that we measure how well a child is doing is through something like academic performance, right? And think about it, academic performance in what? A social studies class that's going to lie to them about the history of their ancestors? Do we want them to do well in that respect? So the way that we frame assimilation or well-adjustedness for children in the system is often based on the standard that we hold about how would a default child or a child of dominant culture fare in this environment. But of course, you know, one of the things that equity work requires us to do is to re-examine the foundations upon which we base this work. And I hear this in this work that people say, well, isn't this just special treatment for people of color? And I always have to remind people, no, you see, the default system under which we've been operating is special treatment for members of a now dominant group. But that standard, that default, it wasn't a scale set at 0. It was a scale that was already skewed. And so moving towards justice means getting closer to 0. And that's not the same as special treatment for group ABC, but rather it's about stopping the suppression of those groups through special treatment for the group XYZ. And so in thinking about standards, it's so important that we remember that as we develop curricula or guidelines for how we want children to thrive and behave, that we also reconsider how we develop those rubrics and how we establish those norms in the first place. You know, in the state of Vermont, we have a state that is the second oldest in the nation. We have the second highest median age after Maine. And it is also the second whitest state in the nation, again, after Maine. But that doesn't really tell the whole story, because when you break that down by racial group, then what you find is that white Vermonters and Indigenous Vermonters have median ages in the mid and late 40s, respectively. But all other Vermonters of color have median ages in the 20s. So what that tells us is that it's people of color who are keeping Vermont young, and that tracks with what we know at the national level, which is that the millennial and Gen Z age cohorts are the two most diverse in the US history so far. So when we think about what our future looks like, or rather who our future looks like, and how we're developing goods and services and government accountability for the future of our state, it's so important that we recognize that as our young people move up through the system, through the world, they enter higher ed, they enter the job market, we're going to see an increasingly multicultural composition in the state. And so redesigning and tailoring our services and our systems in a way that's culturally responsive is not just going to be beneficial, it's not going to just make things easier for us, but it really is critical to the survival of our state, because people live in places where they feel safe, where they feel welcome, where they feel that they're being served adequately. And so how do we as a system, whether it's a formal network of government and NGO entities, or informal network of community and advocates and supporters, how do we create a society that is designed for our future leaders to thrive? And that really, it starts with identifying who our future leaders are. So I think that standards and really just identifying that intersection between race and generation is crucial to our ability to make something that really works.
That was really amazing. I actually had missed a couple of seconds because my internet went out, but I'm on my phone while I'm getting my internet back connected. But I was just snapping in the background and saying, this is so true. One of the things that I wanted to mention is that part of dismantling racism within child welfare also in what things have to change in order for the system to look different. And some of that means looking at ourselves. Are we also perpetuating racism within child welfare? Some of our systems are reliant upon the good family
Allison,
model, and it would force us to also change my internet back up. Were you not able?
if you can maybe rewind like 20 seconds, it would be really helpful.
Could you say that one more time?
If you're able to just rewind about 20 seconds, that would be really helpful. I missed a few of those points.
Sure. I was going back to the fact that there are many of us in the helping profession, a lot of us in the nonprofit sector, even some state agency folks who we have to look at ourselves critically and think about the services that we offer families. Are they reliant upon racism within the child welfare sector? Does it require families to be removed in order for us to help those families? Does it require us to continue feeding into things that are in that need to provide our services. And so part of reforming the system is also looking critically within ourselves and asking, are we doing our work the right way? Or are we just contributing to the continuation of racism within our sector, within our work? That is a hard question. It has forced me, even as a policy advocate, to say, am I only addressing the problems and not the systemic issues? And some of the things that I've had to start doing is we have to do a little bit of both. And I'm slowly starting to emphasize more on the systemic issues, because in child welfare, some of this may feel like, yeah, but do you understand the crisis that we're in right now? Do you understand what the family needs right here and right now? We're always going to be in the right here and right now if we don't ever take a moment to take a step back and say, okay, the house is on fire. What is starting the fire? How do we address the fire that keeps coming? Those sorts of things. So again, I'm going to fix my internet on my computer and join back there.
Allison, are you able to show the image that you brought today to talk about sort of the broader context that creates the system that we've inherited today?
I can, if you just give me 2 minutes to get my internet back working on my computer, and I'll do that in just a second. If you want to, if anybody wants to share other thoughts.
Several people who have introduced themselves in the chat.
Great.
Appreciate the broad representation that we have today. We did have a few questions that came in, and some of them may have gone just to me directly, not to the whole group. And so I just kind of want to highlight when Allison was talking about systemic accountability, there were a few questions that came back to the group around sort of what is available, particularly for people of color in the system, and how can we kind of as a state know how we're doing with the data that we have. And so I'm not going to put people who work for the state on the spot in this call who didn't come prepared to talk, but I'm wondering if anybody who's on the call has any experience with that and wants to share a little bit. I'm going to default to you, Shela, if nobody else jumps in.
Sorry, Allison, can you repeat your question? I mean, Amy, can you repeat your question?
Well, I've gotten a couple questions in the comment around like the bigger systemic accountability and sort of what happens when the system may not be working for individuals or whole groups of people. And I'm wondering, you know, what your experience has been, what kinds of checks and balances do we have, and what works and what might be helpful moving forward.
You know, other people might have other experiences, but for doing this for almost 2 decades, unfortunately, my experiences have been primarily negative. In terms of checks and balances and accountability for the DCF system, I feel like that is one of the reasons why we're having these conversations and choosing to engage in these series of listening sessions, because many people from around the state across all sectors of life are saying that there's a lack of accountability with DCF. What I've seen is trying to figure out how we can create accountability for DCF. I also sit on the Racial Disparities in Criminal and Juvenile Systems panel, and on that panel, DCF is also on that panel as well, and is represented by the commissioner, formerly our former commissioner, which is Ken Schatz. He is currently retiring, and there's somebody else coming in. But on that committee and panel, we're specifically looking at the disparities of people of color within those systems, including DCF, and looking at what are discussion points, what are touch points, what are the issues not only in the criminal justice system, but how do youth get there? So looking at RSOs in the schools and the prison pipeline from the schools, and how that feeds into DCF, and how DCF feeds into the prison pipeline, and how that feeds into mass incarceration. So really going upstream, talking about systemically of like what Allison was saying, like why is the house on fire right now? And us really being able to look at what is going on that we're not able to make complaints, that we're able to make complaints, but it doesn't seem as though people's concerns are being addressed either in a timely manner or in a manner that is humane, in a way that's consistent, in a way that is sort of homogeneous around the state, or that is collecting the same information. There's so many gaps, so many loopholes with data, with overturn of DCF staff, with the systems, with the history, the systemic history, with the people who were in it. So to be honest with you, all of my families throughout almost the last 20 years have rubbed up against that accountability piece. And even though, of course, there are systems put in place for DCF, the access to those systems is very difficult, very difficult. And they make it so a lay person who has their children taken away has to go through these processes that are convoluted, complicated, trauma-inducing, and sometimes are not even digestible, whether it's the languages, whether it's the access to the actual documents, or whether it's the people themselves. And so we're finding that the lack of the ability to create a system that actually holds DCF accountable is one of the underbellies of the conversations that we'll be continuing to have.
That was really awesome. Apologies for my internet issues. I just got a notification that there's a regional outing where I am, but I am on my hotspot, so hopefully you can see and hear me okay. What I'm going to do next is share a graphic image with you all that explains, it's a visual to help explain through racism within child welfare. And I'm going to make it bigger. It's pretty hard to see right now. Oops, hold on. Oops, no, I have to move you all over to another screen so I can. I don't know why it's not. It is not making it bigger on you all, I'm sorry. Hopefully you all can see it okay. But this tree is really about the roots of foster care, and what it really is an opportunity for us to talk about what this looks like. Oh, I hope it didn't go away. It can, my apologies. I think my internet is just acting funny and can you all see the screen okay? Okay, thank you. I will also share a link to it in the chat in just a few minutes so that you can see it close. The purpose is really to explain some of these root causes and what we do. So some of the root causes of foster care are systemic racism, mass incarceration / war on drugs, white supremacy, structural racism, school funding formulas, minimum wage, not including the cost of not increasing to cost of living, family court laws, public housing, TANF time limits, and so on and so forth. These are some of these root cause issues that we typically in child welfare don't get the opportunity to really address. And then when we look even closer here at our tree trunk, you can see some of the things that the tree kind of builds upon. So we see that we have more police presence in low-income neighborhoods. We have cultural biases for child rearing, majority white staff, racial biases in the workforce, and even one that we see a lot of is expedited termination of parental rights, which some may feel is a good thing, but it also plays into some of these how children end up in foster care. And then we go all into this tree and see some of the leaves. These are the things that started way down and went all the way up. And now there's some of the things that we're seeing. We're seeing, around 500 youth aging out of foster care each year, a lack of kinship care supports in the system or preference for kinship care, poor outcomes for youth in foster care, some of those examples, low educational attainment, job attainment, incarceration rates, disproportionate number of Black children represented in foster care, a greater number of placement changes for Black children, lack of funding for community-based prevention programs, greater emphasis on adoption versus reunification, and lack of support. It says Virginia tribal families, but in Vermont, it would be Vermont tribal families. And so this example is really to start a conversation and for you to see it and how we often work. We're often focused our work on these leaves. We're looking at like, okay, there's a disproportionate number of Black children in foster care. How do we address that? Or how did we get, and we don't even think about, let's talk about how we got here, necessarily just happening in your local, your local.
So Allison, while your internet is coming back, I'm just going to pause really quickly. Xusana is about ready to pause, and I just wanted to thank her for her participation today and give her the chance to.
The causation that. Is she still on, or did she already exit?
I'm here. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think it's going slowly for her because what she's saying is so important. We really have to hear it. So yeah, again, I just want to thank you all for having me here. Unfortunately, I do need to jump off of the call because a lot is happening in the legislature, and there's a lot of sort of impromptu emergency discussions that have to happen. So I apologize for needing to bow out early, but
hey, Amy,
I'm so grateful for this conversation.
You want me to go ahead and continue, or did you want? There we go. Yes.
You know, thinking about systems and the ways that they interact, it requires not just that we as practitioners be energized to do something about it, but it also requires top-down leadership. And I think this gets at the question that we heard earlier about what does it take when systems don't work for people or work for entire groups? It takes firm and explicit leadership to say, we recognize that whether intentionally or unintentionally, our policies and practices are having disparate impacts on certain groups. We're not okay with disparate impacts, and we're going to get at the root causes. And that's what's really difficult, right? Because it's easy for us to make superficial changes. It's easy for us to appoint a brown person to a conspicuous position of leadership and say, see, we're not racist. Or it's easy for us to say, well, you know, we hired 22 Asian people last year. Great, but are they all on the same level of employment? Are they involved in the decision-making in leadership circles? Are these the same people who you're counting of color who were here last year? Or do you have high rates of churn that we're not surfacing in the data, right? So not just about more diversity, because diversity is just a numbers game, but it's really about meaningful inclusion and about making more of the foundational changes. Fewer superficial changes, more foundational changes that are going to get at those root causes, right? So let's talk about housing instability. Let's talk about employment discrimination. Let's talk about the way that the war on drugs has negatively, that's either the census or I'm receiving a package. Let's talk about the way that the war on drugs has negatively impacted people's job prospects, stunting their earning potential, and thus making it more difficult to show financial security, which is one of the measures that we use to determine fitness to have a child, right? So these are all important things, and I hate to bring up all these topics and then run away, but I mean, again, these are conversations that have to happen more than just one day. I'm grateful to be part of it, and I thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, and can you all hear me a bit better now? So what I'm doing is I'm connected on my phone for video, and I'm connected on my very terrible hotspot internet so you can see my screen, but I'll probably just stay on my phone so you can hear me a bit better. I was just wrapping up this Roots of Foster Care diagram and tree to just really reiterate part of it too for you all to consider is why do we continue to really address the leaves and not the root? Does it feel like it's not a part of our work? Do we feel disconnected from those issues? Do we feel like they're so challenging and so systemic that we don't know where to start? Some of that is, you know, those feelings are valid, but some of the next steps to take are, we have to do more collaboration with other state agencies so that we can work together to address some of these underlying systemic issues together. Because when children and families are involved in child welfare, as you all know, they're often involved in many other systems. And when we are not working together, that impact is felt even greater on those families. And I don't know if there were any questions, because I keep losing the chat because of my internet, but I'd be happy to answer any, especially related to this tree diagram. And either Kate or Amy can point me in the direction if there are any.
There haven't been any questions specific to the tree. There have been a few questions around just, you know, whether confidentiality is a main barrier in addressing concerns and having a more open discussion. There's been some gratitude and applause for some of the comments around the systemic racism pieces that you brought up, but I haven't seen any specific to the tree at this point.
Okay. Well, I'm glad that the information is really resonating with folks. It can be really difficult to digest all at the same time because it feels like a lot. I haven't heard from a lot of folks, at least in my state, of confidentiality being one of the main barriers in addressing some of the concerns that we're bringing up today, but it certainly doesn't mean that it isn't one, and probably is something for more conversation around what that might look like and feel like in your specific case.
I'm wondering if that might be a question for Shela as well, in terms of the advocacy work that you've done.
I was thinking the same thing.
So when you're saying in my specific case, can you rephrase that, Allison, for me?
Oh, I was just saying if there might have been examples in specific cases or specific circumstances where confidentiality played a role in not being able to address some of the underlying concerns that racism was playing a factor in that for that family.
Thank you. I would say superficially, yes. Almost every encounter that I have with the DCF system says that they cannot say, do, interact, give some information because of confidentiality. So if it's at one stage or at another, it is consistent within DCF to use confidentiality as a means to advocate on behalf of somebody, as a means to not have access to information, whether that could be case plans, whether that could be, I've even asked things as such policies, even though policies are supposed to be on the web or they're supposed to be open to the public, actually trying to access those policies. Sometimes they're not placed in the right places. Sometimes they're not up to date. Sometimes it's not the actual information. And so there's a lot of confidentialities that come with trying to address DCF and hold DCF accountable. I know that most recently we had some experiences around case plans. And even though I had been an advocate for this family for years, had been in the room for years, they knew me for years, somehow all of a sudden it was like, no, everything is confidential. And now we have these other people, and if you get that case plan, we have to redact, all that information, so we don't want to take that time out. And then it becomes a situation where if you really want that information, you can get it from your person. We can't give you anything, but then they don't give the person I'm working with the updated information or the correct information. So it goes around and around. So I feel that confidentiality has absolutely been a factor in DCF being held accountable to either information, complaints, or within trying to navigate how families can reunite.
Thanks. One thing that made me think about that I wanted to share that may not even seem like a barrier is thinking about some of the procedures that are in place for families around permanency hearings, around family meetings, and really thinking about those time limits that families face when they're trying to reunify with their children. So let's, for example, and some of you just, this is like so obvious, and maybe for others it isn't, but if you have a family who is, their child is in foster care and the parent is dealing with substance use disorder, we always know in substance use disorder recovery that using is a part of recovery. And when the timelines do not match that recovery trajectory, we're automatically putting children into a position where we're making it next to impossible for those families to have those children reunified. When you couple that with a child who is not white, who is, who their family is already being seen as maybe not necessarily the good family because they're living in a lower income housing or whatever the case may be, it makes it extremely difficult for that family to reunify with that child. And that happens over and over and over again. So sometimes it has to take a step back and say, does this make sense? Who really benefits from these permanency timelines? And who is disproportionately impacted by our permanency timeline? So that might mean looking into your data and saying who is most likely to be removed from their at this point in their case history, or in the case, if you look at the data and it says the majority of Black children are removed at this hearing, that's when you can start to dive deep and say, what is happening here? What are we not providing for these families, or what are we assuming that families need to have in order for them to have their children back? Another thing to look at is really looking into the policies and saying, do they make sense anymore? Or does this how families really live? If the policy is that each child of a different gender needs to be in separate rooms, taking a step back and saying, does that always make sense? Is that the one barrier that is keeping this child from living with their kinship, their grandparent, or being reunified with their family, when we know that communities of color tend to do it this way anyways? Asking yourself and your system those critical questions that we just kind of take as that's just the way it is. We don't have to have systems like that anymore. Lots of snaps. Okay, good. I'm glad that you're all agreeing. And thinking about, and someone's asking, is there a best practice dashboard of data that Vermont should? This is really interesting to me, and Amy, you can probably speak on this more, but I was really astounded when I started looking at the data in Vermont and really the lack thereof. One of the key issues that I have noticed as a outsider from looking at you all's data is probably the number one issue that I had was that your caseworkers get to decide the race of the child when they mark that down in your data system. That is extremely troubling to me for many reasons. As a person of color, I have nieces and nephews who may present as white, but are biracial and have, Black history and as part of them, but might be marked as white in your system. So that has to be a priority if you want to start to dismantle racism in your system, is to accurately collect data to show where you actually are. And then there are other data points that really you should be able, from that you should be able to have. You should be able to say, how often are children of color experiencing placement disruptions? That is a huge indicator of what is really happening in your child welfare system. If when you place a child, a white child, if they're more likely to reunify or stay in that home, but a Black child is more likely to move 2 or 3 or 4 times, what is happening? So that you can really dig deep and to see what the real issues are. And Amy, did you want to add to other questions about data and what you've observed?
No, I appreciate you bringing that up. Thank you, Allison. And for those of you who have seen the entire series advertised, you'll notice that the Root is continuing to co-host other conversations with us, including one that's specific to data. And I noticed that in a comment, there was somebody who also shared that DCF is actively working on changing the way data is collected. And we also need to own the fact that the DCF system, or the Child Protection System in Vermont, does not have a data system that works for them at the moment. They're using a DOS-based system from the 80s. And so even when they collect the correct information, it's very hard to work with, and it's really hard for systems advocates to know what is happening. And if we can't know what's happening, we're not able to create good, meaningful solutions. And so, Allison, I agree with you completely that we can't assume people's racial identity. We can't assume people's backgrounds. And I think many people in Vermont have been uncomfortable having these conversations in the past and have defaulted to just kind of guessing as a way to avoid difficult conversations. But let's be honest that when we're removing children from homes, it's a really uncomfortable situation. We're all vulnerable, and it really is the time to ask people, what their background is, and to ask them what is important to them, and to ask children as they age, what they need in a foster family or in the community to feel safe and protected and to thrive. And so that is one piece. We have some data points. We often don't share them just because of the way the data is collected and the inconsistencies across the state. It would be really helpful to have more information to work with.
I also just wanted to...
Exactly. And that to me looks like, oh, go.
I just wanted to add real quickly, because we went from confidentiality to data, and I just wanted to to connect those two, that often in the state of Vermont, because we are the second whitest state in the nation, that the numbers of those peoples of color are so low that then there becomes an identifiable marker in the data. And often what I've been used to in the past was that we're not able to disseminate that, or we're not able to tell people or even gather that real information, because then it will identify that family or those persons because there's so few people. So when we talk about confidentiality, that confidentiality for people of color has been linked to data as well, at least within the state of Vermont.
That's such an excellent point to bring up, and I think it resonates with me, and I'm sure lots of other people who are listening, and it'll probably be some advocacy within the legislative process to invest in redoing the data collection system, which in Virginia, I think it's very similar to Vermont, where we purchased our system for like $1 from another state, and we've been using that for a really long time, and it's not working for us anymore. But I know that I wanted to take an opportunity for folks who have questions, so that we have enough meaningful time. Just a reminder to put your questions in the chat box, or things that you maybe feel we haven't gotten to just yet that you want us to talk about more. And I saw a couple of comments asking if I can send that tree around. I will definitely share it with Amy so that she can send it to everyone who has registered for this call, so that the purpose of that tool is to start meaningful conversations. So if you are a local DCF director, you might use that in one of your town hall or staff meetings, so that you can walk this through your team and say, what does this mean to you? What do you think we're doing right? And where can we start? Those sorts of things.
And while the questions are coming in, I also want to recognize Representative Emily Kornheiser and Representative Mary Beth Redmond, who are on the call, and give you an opportunity to share sort of what comes to you from your constituents and what brought you here today.
Thank you very much, Amy. It's a pleasure to be here. I sit on House Human Services, which deals with, we're the Committee of Jurisdiction for all issues that relate to DCF. And then I also participate on the Joint Justice Oversight, or sorry, no, not joint justice, joint child protection oversight. And yes, I have heard from all of these themes and different things that you're mentioning. I have heard from constituents. And I appreciate that last explanation about linking children of color to the confidentiality piece, because I hear that used in a lot of different capacities around the inability to kind of be transparent about what's going on, because people are easily identifiable. So I thought that was a really important point. I really appreciated what Xusana Davis said. I feel like in so many of our different agencies and departments around state government that we need to really kind of look at things from the systemic level. I mean, they were created with certain premises and concepts and by certain individuals when these offices were created. And I think all of the people that work there, or many of them, maybe not all, but many of them are really well-intentioned and want the system to work well. But I think we just have to come together and be really open about what doesn't work, what doesn't serve the employees, what doesn't serve the children, what doesn't serve the parents. And I, in particular, personally, am really concerned about the lack of an independent voice for children, for their parents. We don't have an Office of the Child Advocate in this state, and I think that is a really serious lack in our system. So that's something I am really looking at in the coming year. We've introduced it a number of times, and it hasn't really, it was going to have some legs this year, but then COVID happened, so we kind of lost our steam. But I do feel like until we can kind of really re-envision the system from the roots up, we need this independent office to really look closely at things and be independent eyes. So I'll stop there, but I just appreciate all of the perspectives, and this is such an important conversation in this area. And there are moms, I hear from moms all the time who are, they don't know what to do. They don't know how to navigate the system. They do not know how to advocate for themselves. And we really need to address this. Thanks.
Hi, thank you. There's a little bit of construction on the other side of my office wall, so if banging starts, I'll just mute myself wherever I am speaking. So I really appreciate being here today. I am not in any relevant committees of jurisdiction at all, but the Office of the Child Advocate is one of my top legislative priorities because I live in a community, along with Shela, that has been deeply impacted by the child protection system and the challenges with the child protection system. When COVID hit, I heard from a lot of folks who are working within the system about fears that we don't have eyes on children and families anymore. And I think that's really one of sort of the essential framing challenges of what we're talking about, that we're using the child protection system to have eyes in people's home and to essentially create a carceral state within families and communities. When I talk to folks, just one community over from me in Bellows Falls, there are families there that remember the eugenics that was pushed by, really performed and acted on by the same child protection system that we have today. And so the idea that child protection is working in collaboration or in community with children and families is very far from the reality of where we are. I really appreciate that tree. And I am, one of my great struggles in the legislature, and one that I'm glad to be in with all of you, is how to have folks look at the roots of the tree or even the trunk of the tree rather than the leaves of the tree, to say if we really care about protecting and supporting children and families, we would be investing in them and their lives and their ability to access food and shelter and income, rather than just punishing people for being poor and Black and struggling. Thank you.
Thank you both. I just want to note that there was a comment about the Office of Child Advocate, and we are going to be hosting a 4th call in the series specific to that topic. And Dr. Moira O'Neill, who is the New Hampshire Child Advocate, will be joining us just to answer questions about their newly established office, how it's functioning, what they've been able to accomplish in the last few years. So I encourage people to join in that conversation if you're able. Happy to talk about it more also after this call, but want to make sure that that we give Shela and the Root Social Justice Center and people around this call that have experienced racism in Vermont plenty of time to talk about their experiences as well.
And Amy, if I may, can I bring up one additional thing that's pretty relevant to right now? Okay, I think she's nodding yes. So something that I wanted to put on everyone's mind who may be dealing with this right now. So a lot of children are in extreme stress right now because of COVID. Some kids are back in school, some kids are doing school virtually, some are doing a hybrid model. And parents are really stressed out and struggling and trying to figure out what is happening. And so consider your child welfare system's response to that stress. You may have, when you're receiving a report during this time and it says, you know, we're worried about this child, consider what someone may have said if it were a white child or if it were a Black child before they picked up the phone or whatever to make a report. Consider, did they reach out to the family? Did they do everything that they could to provide supports in place? And what is provoking them to make that phone call right now for Black families or what else? Because and they need our help. And child welfare doesn't feel helpful to a lot of families. That's just an additional stress. And so consider those things and think about those things as you're moving through this. Once again, it feels like crisis on top of crisis, because we know in child welfare, it feels like it's always a crisis. So we're certainly
I have to cut you off, Kit.
Pandemic that it's making things even more challenging.
I apologize, Allison, your reception is not working properly. So I'm gonna see, Kit, if you can mute Allison for a moment. I'm gonna ask Dawn Ellis if she'd be willing to speak just briefly about her policy work and considerations that she has around approaches to institutional racism in Vermont.
Hi there. Thanks, Amy. Actually, my experience in developing policy has been more across the country, so I can't speak specifically for Vermont, but I certainly live here. I'm a parent here. I have a family here, and these days, as a human rights commissioner for our state, I am clear we're in a time when hate is rising in our state. And in some ways that's helpful for us to be able to identify it, you know, to be able to identify that not everybody supports the idea that we're all people. You look at the tracks across the Black Lives Matter signs that were driven in just days after it was painted. And you talk to people who are protesting and some of the pushback and the hatred that's thrown at them. And it begins to make more apparent that Vermont has many sides to it. We often brand ourselves as very progressive, as even a utopia. And you'll hear that in the messaging. We hear it in, when the various government officials are talking on VPR, they're like, wow, well, we're really glad we're in Vermont. It can't happen here. It doesn't happen here, any of the bad things. And people take a big sigh and they go, oh yes, we're in Vermont. Thank goodness. And then they go moving along on their way. And it's almost a disabling strategy to be able to put that brand in front of people in such a way that they don't look at what work we actually need to do to bring our state forward for everybody who's here, whether we are residents or visitors. But you know, a few things in the media remind us that we're not as welcoming as we can be and as we should be. And so when I think about systemic points for how we begin to tackle institutional racism around families and children in the state, you know, I think about the presenters today who have talked about from their personal experiences what they're working on or where they see the gaps. And I want people to understand that these different silos work together to make an institutional harm. So we had the UVM presenter talking about, UVM Medical Center presenter talking about how they're looking at in health, what happens when there's a bias in place, when it's the pediatrician who determines whether or not they think abuse is there. So if there's a bias as they look and make the call, you begin to institutionalize that bias in the documentation that makes the call and puts it into a document. So you'll have a health piece that has a bias in it. In the education arena, along with the data collection challenges we see with DCF, we see it in education as well in our state. We have such a small population base in general that it's very sensitive to who's within it that is different than the predominant group. So for that reason, it's hard for educators to analyze based on race and ethnicity at a disaggregated level. And then it isn't always happening. And then we lose what happens when it's disproportionate to people. And so really that's a challenge to us to be like, can we create other sorts of clumps? Can we create other sorts of data ways to analyze and disaggregate so that people and families of color can be looked at with the question of, are there different experiences happening here than for the predominant group? And I'd like to take Shela's point on, you know, it's not that it's a predominant group. And I think Allison as well, we are changing in Vermont. And so I have spent time in schools that are a global majority in Vermont. And people aren't aware, but when you take a look at certain neighborhoods and certain places in Vermont, we're a rainbow. We're beautiful, a rainbow of colors and backgrounds and experiences, and even international. And that is Vermont, but it's not part of our brand. And so it's not seen or looked at or probed with questions in the same way that it could be if we thought about that as inherently Vermont. And so in education, you can have a disproportionate set of actions happening, someone failing all of a sudden where they've done well. That can go missed because we're not choosing to be able to dig that deeply based on this idea that it becomes a problem with confidentiality. And so I'm really taking Shela's piece about confidentiality as a weapon and saying, yes, I see it. I see it in the data and lack of questions of that data. You can take a look at, so we have the two silos. We have health, we have education where things can be going wrong, but we'll miss them if we're not asking the questions. And then within DCF itself, we have a set of services that on paper are based on these assumptions around certain kinds of families and certain kinds of expectations of those families. And it does dig into the question that Allison brought up of what are we modeling as a family that's healthy? What we do know when we look across the country, particularly at families of color, is that they have different strategies to basically make it through in a society that can be tremendously hostile and dangerous, and have everything from redlining to lack of grocery stores, to lack of access to capital, to a history of lack of wealth transfer. You can have all of these pieces working against a family, and yet within those families, they have developed strategies that are powerful in how you make it through. And those strategies may include intergenerational relationships. So it can be very matriarchal and very powerfully so, where a grandparent is highly involved in the life of a child, where the idea that you have to have money to buy things that you need can be turned on its head when you have relationships, and you can use those relationships to come up with how am I going to get childcare, and how am I going to get my kids so that they are getting music lessons, and how am I going to get my family so that we are all well fed. All of those things may be troubleshot in a whole other way than whether you have a certain level of a dollar sign that's really artificial, especially when you look at a place like Vermont, where the median income, last I checked, was in the $30,000, $35,000 range a year. What we're talking about are families that don't have access to capital, but have access to networks and relationships to get tremendous things done. But that is completely missing if you look at it through the model of a particular kind of family that is based on the structural assumptions within what is a healthy family and what isn't a healthy family. And so that kind of thing, when you've got these weaknesses at each point of a system that wraps around the health of a child and the family, what you can have is a systemic interaction between those systems that continues to harm the family rather than help the family. And I think, how do we get out of that? You know, how do we break out of that from where we are? And you need to begin, like they're doing in the questions around policing, you need to begin to think about how do we create external guidance, wisdom, and eyes on each of these pieces of the system that have had a play in making it potentially quite inequitable, from families of color and families that are not of color, children of color and children that are not of color. And so if you can imagine, instead of insisting that a family of color is at deficit, you could imagine that families of color have a tremendous amount of wisdom and insight into what works in those communities. And so you could begin to develop the paid advisory sorts of bodies that can help reform in each of these areas. In the health area that the pediatrician was talking about, in the education area, what does it look like when a child is yelled at more by a teacher than the other children? What does it look like when a child is steered away from taking a harder class, although they've got the capacity for it, than not? Being able to tell the people and make hand in hand with the people who are developing the systems what it looks like when it goes wrong, because you're not going to read it in a book. You're not going to know it from your master's degree that came through. We're not that far ahead in being able to teach and understand and codify this. This is not textbook stuff. This is lived wisdom that is missing from the design of the systems that we have. And so, and with DCF itself, what does it look like when a family is healthy, when a family is healing, when a family has arrived and you've missed it? And so being able to have this external piece of accountability and wisdom at each set of the silos that affect families and children, I think, is probably critical in catching and reforming the systemic harms that happen because they're based on ideas that don't apply to families that have had to live with oppression for generations. And so I am excited that there are listening sessions happening right now that begin to peel back the questions about what's happening in Vermont, because I have to say we use our exceptionalism and we use it to hide things. It's something we love to say, thank goodness we're here, we're different, we're unique, but then we do not learn from other communities across the country. We do not take the best practices in cities and countries elsewhere to say, what can we use of them? If we continue to say, Vermont is unique, it is different, we're not gonna do anything like those folks because we're Vermont, we lose the fact that Vermont, again, is growing and changing in ways where the populations that are younger are more of color. And that is continually going to be the case because it's the case in our country. Just because we're behind, just because we're lagging behind based on our demography and based on a history that has not been as inclusive as we'd like. I mean, eugenics kind of drives people away. It's not something that says, welcome, come, stay. It's really a hostile piece of our history that isn't talked about as much as it could be. And so I'm excited for the policymakers and design thinkers in this conversation to be looking at how do we take what we have right now and how do we create quick safety systems? Because every day that the system is trying to take a circle and shove it into a square peg, somebody's getting harmed. And so the sooner we can make sure that there's just accountability on the ground for families and children, the sooner you can at least put a stop to some of the systemic challenges and then begin to design and redesign the kinds of interventions that could truly wrap around a whole family and a community. Because in communities of color, it's not about individualism in the history of many of the communities, indigenous communities, communities from African-American communities, communities with languages that are different than the dominant language. There is an extension, not just of family, but of kin-like family who could be considered as uncles or aunts or just people who are around that family to support them. And in the current idea about what is a healthy family and is it healthy or not, it is very much in practice about snapping them away from these people who matter and have been part of children's lives as they grow up, which seems counterproductive. It seems harmful. And if we can then learn from those communities who have had an extensive networked-based way of raising children and what that does for them, what cultures that allows them to bring forward, whether it's food or language or history, we can begin to build systems that tap that for the health of children and families and our communities.
Thank you so much, Tom. There was so much there. I really appreciate all that you've shared. I want to be mindful that we're getting close to 2 and just want to thank everybody for participating today. Give Allison just a quick chance to say like a 1-sentence wrap up, knowing that we can always follow up again, and then to pass the baton on to our partner and co-host, Shela, to close us out today.
Thanks, Amy. Don, I was like in the background snapping and just hear me, and even if you can't see me, but I was just like, this is a sermon. We need to just stand up. If you were in the room, we would be clapping. I just wanted to note one thing in Virginia that we experience that is just so, it may not seem like racism, but it is, and that is the way we fund kinship care. And so when you're looking at Vermont and saying, okay, what does a family in Vermont get when they are kinship care providers, and what do they get when they are foster families? This can be both monetarily, but also in the appreciation. Are you doing appreciation months and celebrations and all sorts of things for your foster families, and they're feeling loved and cared for, and you want to wrap your arms around them? But with the kinship family, you're like, fill out this form, do this. You have to prove to us that you're capable of taking in these children, even though they have the cultural wisdom to do so. And then instead of celebrating them, it feels like all you're doing is checking them and making sure that they're doing everything the right way. Our attitudes about it, as well as our funding formulas, say a lot about who we value in our system. Our foster families are traditionally white, and our kinship care families are traditionally people of color. So it's something to consider. I have loved this conversation, and we always run out of time with these conversations because there's so much to unpack. But thank you, Amy, for including me. And I think Shela was next.
Great, thank you, Allison. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dawn. Yeah, Dawn, I share so many sentiments that you said. And so I won't spend a lot of time repeating those, but what resonated for me, what you said, was that we want to be strategic and involving strength-based, that we want to be a strength-based community, a strength-based organization, and not be building off of our weaknesses, but be building off of our strengths. And those strengths come from the people who are most impacted in the situation, and that those are our families. I also wanted to say that our data is our stories. And I want to remind us that even though sometimes that anecdotal data doesn't get to be in the system, or even though sometimes it's not looked at as the same as a number, our stories and telling our stories is data. And I encourage people to keep on coming out and to be speaking out, not just for families who are impacted, but for all of you who are supporting those families. We need you to be standing up as well and to be speaking out as well. And I want to say that in the essence of, and I'm going to use this analogy that I don't like because I'm trying to be quick, but a lot of times we're involved in fighting the battle and we can't win the war. And what I mean by that is we're being pit against each other as individuals. And right now we're pit against each other of, clearly those families came into custody for a reason. They had this wrong, this wrong, this wrong, this wrong. And not only are we against those families as a society, but then they're against each other. Something that we do with the program that we run, Families United at the Root Social Justice Center, is one of our agreements is oppression exists. Another one of our agreements is that we will not be pit against each other. And another one of our agreements is that we will create systemic change within the system. Because we had acknowledged that each one of those families, some had substance abuse disorders, some had mental health, some had disabilities, some had all different kinds of issues of why their children were allegedly brought into custody. But at the end of the day, we're being pit against each other as individuals, and we're not breaking down, dismantling, and resisting the systems and the structures that we're talking about. So even when you may be in doubt, even when you might think, oh, maybe that child might be better off in this care, even if that is where you go, we still have to challenge those systems of why that child has to be in that care in the first place. We have to examine those systems, and we can't just chalk it up as that's a bad apple, that's a bad parent, that's bad behaviors, because we have created systems and structures that have created behaviors. We've created systems and structures that have oppressed certain types of people. And we've created systems and structures that does not allow the same access as other families may have. So one of the things that we're doing with Families United is we hope that that group will be created all over the state. And we hope that many allied partners will be coming to support those families as well. And so we really ask you to not only build up the systems that you want, but to continue to resist and dismantle the systems that you don't, and to speak out, because we need to not be pitted against each other. We need this to not be individualized. We need this to be in a conversation of the structures and systems that need to be dismantled, so all of our families can be able to be united and be healthy and well. So I thank you all. I thank you for the opportunity for all of us to be here. Thank you, Amy with Voices for Children, and Allison and Xusana, and everybody, Dr. Metz, and everybody who came onto this call, and all of you participants. We're so appreciative of you joining us, and we hope that you will continue to join these listening sessions as we plan on having many different themes and actually bringing more people in who are most impacted into the conversations.
Thank you all.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.